Welcome to Frozen Fears, scary stories for a rainy night. If you're new here, here's what you can expect. True scary stories paired with some of the best rain sounds to help you relax or fall asleep. These videos are perfect for winding down when nothing else seems to work. The true stories might keep you hooked for a while, so get comfortable, grab a blanket, and cozy up. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. It was the night before the storm, and the town of Ashevale had never felt more suffocating. The wind howled through the trees, bending the branches and sending the fallen leaves skittering across the streets like whispers of something not quite human. There was a strange tension in the air, thick with the scent of earth and decay. People stayed inside their homes, doors locked and windows shut tight, as if they knew something was about to happen, something that couldn't be avoided. In the heart of Ashevale, nestled among tall, ancient trees, stood a mansion long abandoned. Once the home of the wealthy Aldrich family, it had been left to rot after a terrible tragedy claimed the lives of its owners. Rumors said it was cursed, that the wraith of Lydia Aldrich still roamed its halls, searching for something or someone to drag into the darkness with her. But those were just stories, weren't they? At least, that's what Jake thought as he stepped off the bus, his bag slung over his shoulder, the dampness of the cold night air seeping into his clothes. He was new to Ashevale, having moved there just a week ago. The locals were friendly enough, but they all had one thing in common. They warned him, in hushed voices, to avoid the Aldrich mansion. Jake had no interest in ghost stories or curses. He was just looking for a quiet life, away from the chaos of the city. But tonight, something felt different. The warnings lingered in his mind like a persistent echo. The streets were eerily empty, the only sound the gusts of wind pushing against the buildings. Jake quickened his pace, eager to reach his small apartment. But as he passed the edge of the mansion's overgrown property, he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The windows of the mansion were dark, lifeless, but something about them felt like eyes watching him. He shook the feeling off, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild. But as he reached the corner, a cold draft swept down the street, carrying with it a low, mournful cry. It was a sound unlike any he'd ever heard before, distorted, like someone calling out in pain or terror. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt the urge to run. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the air around him grew heavier. His breath fogged in front of him, and for a brief moment, the world went still. The cry echoed again, this time louder, closer, almost as if it were coming from the very mansion itself. Jake turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. There, at the edge of the property, just beyond the twisted iron gates, stood a figure. The wind seemed to die around it, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The figure was tall and thin, draped in tattered white garments that fluttered as though they were caught in an unseen breeze. Its face was obscured by the hood of its cloak, but Jake could feel its gaze piercing through the shadows, locking onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to obey. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. Something about it was hypnotic, like a dark force drawing him in. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it were coming from a place far beyond the living world. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the night, dissolving into the mist that had begun to settle over the town. Jake stumbled back, his breath ragged, his mind reeling from what he had just seen. Was it a person, or something far worse? He didn't wait to find out. Turning quickly, he ran down the street toward his apartment. The image of the figure burned into his mind. But as he rounded the corner, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, that the wraith, whatever it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him. And that night, as he lay awake in his bed, he couldn't escape the sound of the mournful cry. The wind howled outside his window, and deep in his bones, Jake knew that Ashevale was hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sight of the figure by the mansion lingered in his mind like a dark stain, one that wouldn't wash away, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. Every creak of his apartment floor, every gust of wind that rattled his window, made his skin crawl. He tried to convince himself it was just a figment of his imagination. After all, it was a small town, and the locals loved their stories. But deep down, he knew what he had seen was no trick of mind. That night, as he lay in bed, the eerie cry filled the air again. It was distant at first, but it grew louder and more distinct, echoing through the silent streets of Ashevale. It sounded like a woman, lost and in pain. The sound sent a chill crawling down his spine, tightening his chest with a sense of dread that wouldn't let go. Jake pulled the blanket tightly around himself, his mind racing. What had he gotten himself into? The townsfolk had warned him. They had all told him to stay away from the Aldridge mansion, but it was too late now. The Wraith, or whatever it was, had noticed him, and it was clear it wasn't going to leave him alone. The cry grew closer. It was as though the spirit was standing right outside his window, screaming for help, or for something far more sinister. Jake threw the covers off, his heart hammering in his chest. He had to do something. He couldn't sit there, paralyzed by fear, waiting for the nightmare to consume him. With shaking hands, he grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, the night air colder than it had ever been. The moon hung high, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and bend in unnatural ways. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hum of life swallowed by the oppressive silence. Jake's eyes locked onto the mansion in the distance, barely visible through the veil of mist that had begun to creep over the town. The gates stood open now, an invitation, or perhaps a trap. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, pulling him toward the mansion, as if something unseen was guiding him. As he walked closer to the mansion, the air grew colder, heavier. His breath misted in front of him, and a low hum seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath his feet. The mansion loomed larger now, its decaying structure bathed in an ethereal light from the fog. The windows were black, like empty eyes watching his every move. He stepped through the gates, the old metal creaking as it swayed. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds, but it was clear someone had walked it recently. Fresh footprints marked the path in the damp earth. Jake's heart raced as he reached the entrance, the large wooden doors ajar, as though inviting him in. A soft, mournful whisper drifted out from within. He stood frozen for a moment, the noise clawing at his resolve, but his legs moved on their own. He couldn't stop now. Inside, the mansion was even more oppressive. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its once rich colors now long gone, replaced by peeling and cracked surfaces. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay hung heavy, mixing with a strange, sweet fragrance that made his stomach churn. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the silence enveloped him like a living thing. He felt eyes on him from every corner, from every shadow, but when he turned, nothing was there. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, slow and deliberate. Jake stopped, listening intently. The footsteps were soft at first, like the padding of bare feet against the wooden floors, but they grew louder, closer. His pulse quickened. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the temperature dropped so fast Jake's breath came out in visible puffs. The whispers returned, louder now, and they seemed to come from all around him. "Help me! Help me! Save me!" The voice was familiar. It sounded like the cry he had heard earlier that night. But it wasn't just a cry. It was a plea, a desperate call for someone to find the source of the pain, to end the torment. Jake's feet carried him forward, deeper into the heart of the mansion, through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The further he went, the more distorted the air became, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing and shifting with every step. Finally, he came to a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was ajar, the faintest light spilling from within. He pushed it open, and what he saw took his breath away. At the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and warped, but still reflecting something, someone. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadow, but Jake could feel her presence, her sorrow, her anger. She stood there, her long, dark hair floating, as though moved by an invisible breeze, her eyes hidden beneath the hood of her tattered cloak. The Wraith. Her voice filled the room, a soft, mournful whisper. You must free me." Before Jake could react, the air in the room thickened, and a chill ran through him. The shadows twisted, and the room seemed to close in around him. The Wraith's form began to shift, her features becoming more defined, pale skin, hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, shards of glass flying through the air, and in the reflection, Jake saw it, the creature behind him. It was tall, its skin as pale as bone, its eyes burning with an unnatural glow. Its fingers were long, sharp claws that scraped against the walls as it slowly approached him. The Wraith's voice echoed in his mind, louder now. "You are the one. You must set me free, or join me in the darkness forever." Jake turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping him inside. The air thickened, suffocating him, as the creature reached out, its claws scraping the air like a death sentence. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to pull at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thicker, colder, damp with the scent of rot. He could feel the weight of the creature behind him, its eyes burning into his back, its presence suffocating. His body screamed for him to move, but every step felt like he was wading through thick mud. The Wraith's voice echoed in his mind again, soft and insistent. "You are the one. You must free me, or join me in the darkness forever." Jake spun around, his eyes darting from corner to corner, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. His gaze locked onto the shattered mirror, the glass shards now lying scattered across the floor, reflecting the room in distorted angles. The Wraith's face seemed to float among the shards, her hollow eyes following his every movement, and her mouth twisted in a silent scream. His chest tightened as the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Free me, Jake. You are the only one who can." He stumbled backward, his mind racing. What did she want? What did she mean by free me? There had to be a way out. The room felt smaller, more suffocating by the second. The walls seemed to shift, the floorboards creaking beneath him. And then, as if in response to his panic, the temperature dropped even further. His breath came out in visible clouds, his hands trembling. A shadow passed by the corner of his eye, quick and sudden. He whipped his head toward it, but it was gone in the blink of an eye. His pulse quickened. Was it the creature? Was it the Wraith? Suddenly, the air was alive with a low, unsettling hum, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the mansion itself. The windows rattled, the glass groaning under the pressure. The walls began to close in, the doors locking him in a prison of supernatural force. Jake's legs felt like lead as he took slow, cautious steps, every instinct telling him to run, to escape, but he didn't know where to go. Then, the voice came again, clearer now, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. "The mirror, break it." Jake froze, confusion clouding his thoughts. The mirror, but it was already shattered. He glanced back at the jagged shards scattered across the floor, his gaze locking onto one that caught the faintest glimmer of light. It wasn't just a broken mirror. It was a portal, a way for the Wraith to reach through, to draw him in. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The pull of the mirror, the Wraith's voice, it was all consuming him. Without thinking, Jake lunged forward and grabbed one of the larger shards of glass, its sharp edges digging into his hand. Blood dripped from his palm, but he didn't feel the pain. He was too focused on the task at hand. With a swift motion, he hurled the shard toward the mirror's reflection. The glass collided with the cracked surface with a sickening sound. For a moment, nothing happened. The air remained thick, the shadows unchanged. But then, crack, the mirror seemed to split open, the glass fracturing like a spider's web, sending tendrils of shadow into the room. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the shadows grew, swirling around him like smoke, suffocating the very light in the room. The Wraith's form materialized from the darkness, her face now fully visible, pale, hollow, with eyes that seemed to weep blood. She reached out toward him with bony, trembling hands, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice now more chilling than ever, echoing with a deep sorrow. "Now, you will join me." The room began to spin, the walls warping and bending as though the very mansion was alive, pulling at him from all sides. Jake's knees buckled beneath him as the shadows seemed to reach for him, pulling him into their cold embrace. He struggled, but his body felt heavy, as though an unseen force was pressing down on him, keeping him rooted in place. The Wraith's presence was overwhelming. He could feel her icy touch against his skin, could feel her fingers brushing over his face, colder than the deepest winter. He tried to scream, but the air was sucked from his lungs. It was as though he was drowning in darkness. In the chaos, Jake's mind raced, searching for a way out. He remembered the stories the townsfolk had whispered about the Aldridge mansion, the curse, the Wraith, the souls lost within its walls. What if there was a way to break it, to free both himself and the spirit trapped here? Then, something inside him clicked. He remembered the old stories about mirrors, about how they could trap souls, reflect curses, and hold spirits prisoner. Maybe breaking the mirror had been a mistake. Maybe the answer wasn't in destroying it, but in using it to confront the Wraith's torment. His grip on the shard tightened. Without thinking, he raised it toward the mirror's shattered remnants, and with all his strength, he thrust it into the center of the broken glass. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, the world exploded in a burst of light. The shadows screamed, swirling violently around him, and the Wraith let out a cry of anguish. The mansion trembled, as though it were on the brink of collapsing, the weight of its dark history finally catching up with it. The mirror began to glow, its cracked surface mending itself slowly, piece by piece. "No, no, you cannot." The Wraith's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar of fury, of desperation. Jake pushed against a force, his body shaking as the light from the mirror intensified. He could feel the Wraith's spirit struggling, fighting against the pull of the mirror, but Jake was determined. He had to stop her from claiming another soul. With one final, desperate effort, Jake plunged the shard into the center of the glowing mirror. The air crackled with an otherworldly energy as Jake's hands gripped the shard tighter. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it drowning out everything else. The light from the shattered mirror was blinding now, casting harsh shadows across the walls as the Wraith let out a scream so raw, so filled with anguish, that it seemed to shake the very foundation of mansion. Her form writhed in the glow, her face twisting in torment as if the light itself was burning her from the inside out. "You cannot escape me." Her voice was distorted, a combination of rage and despair. "I am bound here, and you will be bound with me." Jake felt a coldness gnawing at his bones, the weight of the Wraith's curse threatening to pull him under. The room around him was alive, shifting and warping as though the mansion itself was responding to her cries. The walls twisted and undulated, the floors groaning with the weight of centuries-old secrets, and the very air seemed to ripple with the pressure. But Jake was resolute. He had no choice now but to face her, to free himself and the spirit trapped in the mirror. He couldn't let her drag him into the darkness, couldn't allow the mansion to claim another soul. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jake thrust the shard deeper into the mirror's glow, his fingers burning from the intense heat radiating off it. The Wraith's screams grew louder, her form starting to flicker like a candle in the wind. She was weakening. He could feel it. "Please, don't do this." Her voice was now a soft, desperate plea. "I was once like you, trapped alone. But you don't understand. If you break me, You break everything." Jake's chest tightened. Her words echoed in his mind, but he knew better than to listen. The Wraith was a prisoner of her own curse, and her sorrowful plea was nothing but manipulation. She wasn't seeking freedom. She was seeking to claim him, to trap him in the mansion, as she had done with so many others before. "I am sorry," Jake whispered to the air, though his voice wavered. "But I cannot let you take me." He drove the shard in deeper, piercing the heart of the mirror. The light exploded in a flash of searing brilliance. For a split second, Jake thought he would be consumed by it, that the darkness would swallow him whole. But then, silence. The shadows recoiled, vanishing as though they were never there. The mansion's walls stopped moving, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. Jake blinked, disoriented, as the light from the mirror slowly dimmed to a faint glow. The Wraith's form was gone. The room was still, save for the soft shuffling of footsteps behind him. Jake turned, his breath catching in his throat. A woman stood there, pale, ethereal, yet no longer filled with the darkness that had haunted him. She was the Wraith, but she was different now. No longer twisted by rage or sorrow. She stood before him, her features soft and serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice gentle and grateful, no longer distorted by pain. "You have freed me." Jake didn't know how to respond. The fear, the terror that had gripped him moments ago, was now replaced with an overwhelming sense of relief. The mansion, once alive with the echo of anguish, now seemed still, empty, yet peaceful. "What happens now?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled softly, her form shimmering slightly in the fading light. "I can finally rest. My time here is over, but I owe you more than you know." She raised her hand, and in the distance, the sound of the mansion shifting and creaking seemed to fade. The oppressive air lifted completely, and the faintest breeze swept through the room, as though the mansion itself was breathing a sigh of relief. "Go," she said. "You are free now, and so am I. The curse is broken." Before Jake could say anything more, her form began to dissolve into the light, the last remnants of her spirit fading like smoke on the wind. The mansion, once dark and suffocating, seemed to come alive with a new energy, one that wasn't oppressive, but peaceful. The walls no longer groaned with the weight of its dark past, and the air was clear. Jake stood in the center of the room for a moment longer, taking in the calm that now surrounded him. He didn't know how to explain it, but felt as though the mansion had finally found peace, as though the Wraith's torment had been lifted, and so had his own. He turned toward the door, the path back to freedom now clear. As he stepped outside, the fog that had once enveloped the mansion began to lift, and the moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the land in a soft, silvery glow. The world felt normal again, but as Jake stepped onto the gravel path leading away from the mansion, he couldn't help but look back one last time. The mansion, now silent and still, stood like a monument to its forgotten history. The trees around it whispered in the wind, and for a brief moment, Jake thought he heard a faint whisper in the air. "Thank you," and then it was gone. The night of the Wraith had ended. Months passed since Jake had left the mansion behind, its dark past now laid to rest. The town, once wary of the cursed structure on the hill, had begun to forget its eerie tales. Life returned to normal, the fog that had hung heavy over the mansion finally dissipating. But Jake couldn't shake the memories, the feeling that something was still lingering. One evening, as he walked past the town's old bookstore, he spotted a familiar face in the window. The woman, the one he had seen in the mansion, the Wraith who had once been trapped in darkness, was sitting in the corner, reading a book, her pale fingers tracing the pages as though time had not passed. Jake froze. His heart skipped a beat. She hadn't disappeared, had she? His breath hitched in his chest as the door to the bookstore swung open, and the woman, with her gentle smile, stepped outside. There was no mistaking her. The same serene expression, the same unearthly beauty. I didn't expect to see you here, she said softly, her voice calm, almost too calm. Jake's throat tightened, his mind racing. How are you here? I thought. His words trailed off, unsure of how to make sense of what was happening. The woman's smile didn't fade. I told you that I would find peace. The mansion was just one part of my story, but the darkness was never me, Jake. It was a part of me that I had to let go of. She paused, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding. And now, I am no longer bound to the past. Jake blinked, the weight of her words settling on him. He had assumed that once the curse was broken, once the mansion had been freed from the Wraith's hold, everything would be over. But now, in front of him, stood a woman, alive, whole, and no longer a part of the haunting memory he'd tried to escape. Are you real? Jake finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. She chuckled softly. I'm as real as you are. Maybe more so now. Thanks to you. You broke the chains that bound me to that place. And I am free. Jake swallowed hard, unsure if he understood. She had been a ghost, a wraith. Yet now she stood before him in full, living form, untainted by the darkness that had once claimed her. But why? Jake asked, his confusion growing. Why did you come here, to this town? Why are you here? In this world now? The woman looked toward the horizon, her gaze thoughtful. When I was trapped in that mansion, I couldn't move on, couldn't find peace. But now, I realize I've been given a second chance. Not to change what happened in the past, but to embrace the future. And you. She turned back to him, her eyes soft with gratitude. You gave me that chance. I owe you more than you know. Jake's heart softened, but he couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled within him. Had a wraith truly been freed, or had something else been set in motion? Before he could voice his concerns, the woman reached out, gently placing her hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, comforting, as if a piece of her had been restored. Don't worry, she said softly. I am no longer the creature you faced. I am free to live, to learn, to grow. But the mansion will always be a part of me, as it is a part of you now. Jake felt a sudden chill, as if an unseen force passed through him. He looked over his shoulder, toward the hill in the distance where the mansion stood silent and still. It was then that he realized the mansion had become more than just a place of darkness. It was a reminder, a symbol, the history, the curse. It had become part of him now, part of his story, just as it had been for her. I need to go now, the woman said softly, releasing her grip. But I will always remember you, Jake. You set me free, and I will find my own path from here. Jake nodded slowly, still processing everything. As she turned and walked away, a strange peace settled over him. He watched her fade into the crowd, blending into the ordinary world, and wondered if her presence had truly been real, or if he had imagined it all. But then, as the evening air cooled and the town lights flickered on, Jake felt something, a quiet whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words, but a feeling, a presence. The wraith had found her peace, and now she was gone. But Jake would never forget. The old mansion sat at the edge of the town, forgotten by most, its once grand walls now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. It was a place that people whispered about, but rarely dared to visit. The locals spoke of strange happenings, eerie sounds that echoed through the halls, and the unsettling feeling that something or someone was watching from behind the broken windows. It was known as Blackthorn Manor, a place steeped in mystery, with its dark history shrouded in layers of dust and time. For Emma, the house was more than just a spooky tale passed around the fire. She had recently inherited it from a distant relative she had never met, and with it came a strange compulsion to uncover its secrets. She had always been drawn to the unknown, to places where others feared to tread. The thought of exploring Blackthorn Manor filled her with an inexplicable sense of excitement, mixed with the tiniest bit of dread. The mansion was far from welcoming. The gate creaked open as Emma pushed it, the rusted metal groaning under her touch. She stepped onto the path, the gravel crunching beneath her boots as she made her way up to the front door. The windows were boarded up, and the once beautiful front yard was now a wild tangle of weeds and thorny bushes. Despite the neglect, Emma could see remnants of the house's former grandeur, ornate carvings above the door, marble pillars still standing, though cracked and worn. She took a deep breath and knocked on the heavy wooden door, which opened with a loud, protesting squeak as though it hadn't been moved in years. A cold breeze swept past her, and she shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her body. "Hello," she called out into the darkness. The silence answered back, suffocating and complete. Stepping inside, Emma was immediately struck by the musty, stale air. It was as if the house had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to return. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and dust hung thick in the air. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the room, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the house settling. As she explored further, Emma's curiosity grew. She could feel the weight of the house's history in every step, every cracked floorboard. She wandered through rooms that seemed to stretch into infinity, each one more forgotten than the last. She could sense something not quite right, lurking in the shadows, just beyond her line of sight. In the heart of the mansion, she found a grand hallway, at the end of which stood an antique mirror, framed in gold that had long since tarnished to a dull bronze. The mirror seemed out of place in the decaying surroundings, its surface still clean, almost too clean, reflecting the dim light of the hallway. Emma's heart raced as she approached it, drawn in by some unknown force. When she looked into the mirror, the reflection that stared back at her wasn't her own. At first, Emma thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The face in the mirror was distorted, a blur of shadows and light, but was unmistakably a person, someone with pale skin and hollow eyes. The figure's mouth opened in a silent scream, and Emma recoiled, stumbling backward. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing as she turned away, but the reflection stayed with her, burned into her vision. "No, it's just a trick of the light," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. "It's nothing." But as she looked back at the mirror, the reflection was still there, now clearer. The figure was a woman, dressed in a long, dark gown. Her features were sharp, almost skeletal, and her eyes were empty, like twin black holes that seemed to draw in everything around them. The woman's lips parted again, and this time Emma could hear the faintest whisper, a sound that chilled her to the bone. "Down." The voice was low, a rasping breath that barely made it past her own trembling ears. Emma froze, her heart hammered in her chest. She glanced around, but the rest of the house was silent. The whisper had come from the mirror, from the reflection. She knew it. She felt it deep within her bones. Before she could react, the lights flickered, and for a split second, everything around her seemed to shift. The air grew thick, heavier, as though the room itself was closing in on her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She turned away from the mirror, desperate to escape the oppressive presence that seemed to surround her. But when she looked back, the reflection had changed again. Now, the woman in the mirror was standing directly behind Emma. Her face was twisted in agony, her hollow eyes fixed on Emma with a piercing, otherworldly intensity. The woman raised a bony hand, her fingers stretching out toward Emma, who couldn't move, frozen in fear. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, and the woman's mouth began to form words, but they were unintelligible, a language Emma didn't recognize. "Leave now," the voice demanded, and Emma felt the chill of its command run through her veins. Panicking, Emma turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the house. She could hear the whisper following her, growing louder, and though she tried to block it out, it was impossible. She stumbled through the house, running faster and faster, not caring where she was going, just desperate to get away from that mirror, from that cursed reflection. She reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was holding her prisoner. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else, until they were all she could hear. The very walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an ancient malice. In a last frantic attempt, Emma turned back toward the mirror in the hallway, hoping for some way out, some clue to break the curse that had taken hold of her. And that's when she saw it. A figure stood behind her in the reflection. Not the woman, but something far darker. Something that was not human at all. It was the reflection of a shadow, tall and grotesque, its shape impossibly twisted, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, showing rows of jagged teeth. The shadow in the mirror reached for Emma, its fingers curling and uncurling as if it were about to step through the glass. "You belong to the house now," the voice rumbled, a low growl that filled her very soul. Emma screamed, her throat raw with terror, but no sound escaped. The house, the mirror, the curse, everything seemed to close in around her until there was nothing left but darkness. And then there was nothing at all. Emma's scream echoed in her mind, but was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. The darkness that had swallowed her seemed endless, as though time itself had stopped. Her body felt frozen, heavy, as though invisible chains bound her to the spot, her limbs paralyzed in fear. The shadow in the mirror reached toward her, its distorted form stretching beyond the frame. With a surge of panic, Emma snapped her eyes away from the mirror, her breath shallow and rapid. She had to move. She had to escape. But the house, no, the mansion, seemed to have become alive, its walls closing in on her, its very foundation shifting beneath her feet. The temperature had dropped to an unbearable chill, the air thick with something ancient and wrong. The whispers from the mirror now seemed to come from all around her, their words incomprehensible, yet full of malice. "Get out, now." The voice from the reflection rumbled again, louder this time, vibrating the floor beneath her. The whisper wasn't just in her ears now. It was in her mind, in her very soul, clawing at her thoughts. The shadow in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was something more, something that had crossed the threshold between worlds. Emma's legs finally obeyed, and she staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't stay here, couldn't let the house claim her, as it had done to others before her. She turned and ran, not caring where she was going, her eyes wild with terror. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, twisting, warping in the dim light. Every door she passed led to more darkness, more shadows that felt like they were reaching for her. A sudden crash echoed from behind her, and Emma spun around, her blood running cold. The mirror was gone. The hallway that had once been lined with old portraits and cracked wallpaper was now replaced by something else, an endless, black void, stretching forward and pulling her toward it like a vortex. She stumbled back, but her foot caught on something hard, something cold and wet. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat. The floor was no longer wood, but a dark, slick surface, like black ice. A puddle of water, or was it something worse? Spread across the floor, and within it, distorted shapes began to form, shapes that seemed to be trying to rise from the depths. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice hoarse from fear. But the shadows in the water only rippled in response. The whisper grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the air, inside her head. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus of voices, low and guttural, all speaking at once, each one drenched in agony. They seemed to be pulling her toward them. "You cannot escape. You are already a part of us." Emma stumbled backward, her eyes wide, as the darkness seemed to swallow her up. The air felt thick with something suffocating, something that felt like hands around her throat. And in the center of it all, the shadows began to form shapes again. The figures from the mirror, the woman with hollow eyes, the shadowy specter, now stood before her in the center of the room. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, trembling uncontrollably. Her breath was ragged, panic coursing through her veins. But when she tried to scream again, no sound escaped. It was as if the house had silenced her. The figures moved closer. The woman, her skeletal hands reaching out, her hollow eyes filled with an unspoken hunger. She knelt down beside Emma, the cold emanating from her like an icy wind. Emma could feel the pull of the house, drawing her in, her strength draining away as the shadowy forms surrounded her. "You belong to us, forever," the voice, now a chorus of whispers, spoke as one. In that moment, Emma felt it, the chilling realization that she had walked into something that could not be undone. The house had chosen her. She was no longer an outsider. She had become part of its cursed history, bound to the mansion like the others before her, like the shadows that now circled her. And then, the woman in the dark gown leaned in, her cold breath washing over Emma's skin as she whispered one final time, "Welcome home." The last thing Emma felt was the chill of the woman's touch, and then, nothing. The silence that followed Emma's final breath was suffocating. The oppressive darkness in the mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. And then, like a ripple in a still pond, the world shifted. Emma's eyes opened again, but something was wrong. The air felt colder, denser, as if she were submerged in water. Her body felt heavy, yet she couldn't move. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Panic gripped her chest as she realized she wasn't in the mansion anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and endless, as if she were floating in a void of pure blackness. As her mind scrambled for answers, she felt it, a presence. She wasn't alone. There were others here with her. In the distance, faint figures began to emerge from the darkness, their shapes hazy and distorted. Faces, twisted in agony, appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Each one seemed familiar, though Emma couldn't place them. They were as lost as she was, trapped in this cursed place, waiting. The cold began to bite at her skin, colder than anything she had ever felt. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps, visible in the frigid air. And then she saw it, a figure standing before her, emerging from the shadows. It was the same woman she had seen in the mirror, the one with the hollow eyes and the twisted face. But this time, she wasn't a reflection. She was real. Her skeletal hands reached out toward Emma, her long fingers curling slowly. Emma tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't respond. The woman's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was something far darker, something that filled Emma's chest with dread. "You're one of us now," the woman said, her voice cold and hollow, echoing around Emma. "Welcome to your new home." The words didn't make sense. Emma struggled, trying to fight the paralysis that gripped her body. She could see the other figures in the distance, their faces twisted in despair, some reaching out to her, others staring blankly into nothingness. The mansion, the mirror, everything was gone. She was trapped in a limbo of shadows and cold, her body bound to the very essence of this place. But Emma refused to give in. Her heart was still beating, her mind still fighting. She forced herself to take a breath, and then another. The woman in front of her watched silently, her expression unreadable. Emma tried to speak, but her voice was still lost in the suffocating air. "Why are you doing this?" Emma finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse and weak. The woman's cold eyes flickered with something, perhaps amusement, perhaps pity, but she didn't answer immediately. She just stared at Emma, as if contemplating something deeper than the question. The shadows around them seemed to shift, as if they had a life of their own, twisting and swirling in eerie patterns. "You've been marked," the woman said, her voice softer now, but no less chilling. "The mirror took you, just as it has taken many before you. Those who stare too long, those who venture too far into the unknown, they become a part of it. Part of us." Emma's heart sank as the woman's words sank in. She was a part of this cursed existence now, just as the others had been before her. The mansion, the mirror, it was all part of a web that stretched beyond time, beyond understanding. "But I'm not dead," Emma whispered, desperation lacing her words. "I'm still alive. You can't keep me here." The woman's hollow gaze softened for a moment, as if considering Emma's plea. But then, slowly, she shook her head. No one escapes, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. Not once you've been chosen. You belong to the house now, just as we all do. You'll remain here, trapped in this place, forever. Emma's mind raced. There had to be a way out. She couldn't just accept this fate. She wasn't ready to become a shadow, a lost soul trapped in this nightmare. The others in the distance, could they be freed? Could they help her? But before she could form another thought, the world around her began to shift again. The shadows moved faster now, as if they were closing in on her, circling her. The air grew heavier, suffocating her with its cold grip. She felt a sudden pull at her chest, a deep, insistent tug, as if the mansion itself was drawing her in. The woman's figure began to fade into the darkness, her voice echoing one final time. You will never escape. And then, Emma was plunged into darkness once more. When she awoke again, it was different. She was no longer in the void, nor was she in the mansion. Instead, she was back in the hall, the same hall where she had first encountered the mirror. But now everything was different. The house was alive, the air thick with an unnatural presence. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they had a heartbeat of their own. And the mirror, oh, the mirror was there again, standing tall in the center of the room, reflecting nothing but the eerie, pulsating darkness around it. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. The figure in the mirror was someone else. A pale, skeletal woman, dressed in tattered rags, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. She was staring back at Emma, her gaze filled with silent sorrow. And then, the woman raised a bony finger to her lips. "Shoo," she whispered. And just like that, Emma knew. She wasn't just a part of the house. She was its next reflection. The cycle had begun again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the world around her began to swirl, the familiar hallway dissolving into an oppressive, dark fog. The mirror in front of her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, reflecting her. No, not her anymore, but something else. The woman in the mirror was now standing closer, her hollow eyes fixated on Emma, her thin lips parting into a twisted smile. You can't escape it, the woman's voice echoed in Emma's mind, vibrating through her very bones. You are me now. We are one. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the shadows around her began to lengthen, stretching toward her like long, twisted fingers. The house was shifting again, its walls trembling, groaning as if the very structure of it was alive. The mirror no longer reflected her face. It was as though the house had taken her essence, replacing her with a figure from another time, another soul. She tried to back away, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Every time she moved, the reflection in the mirror mirrored her exactly. But its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, followed her every movement, no longer the reflection of herself, but of something far darker. It's too late, the voice whispered, the words full of sorrow and malice. You will become part of the house. You are already a reflection in its endless walls. Suddenly, the darkness around her grew colder. The floor beneath her feet cracked, and Emma stumbled as it shifted, as though the mansion itself was rearranging itself to swallow her whole. The walls began to stretch, twisting into endless corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, but somehow pulled her forward. The whispering voices from the shadows grew louder, more frantic, more desperate. Emma's pulse quickened as she realized the truth. She wasn't merely stuck in this house. She was becoming part of it, a permanent fixture in its malevolent existence. Her mind raced as she tried to find a way to break free. But each thought was like a thread caught in the web of shadows that surrounded her. She was suffocating. The house has chosen you, the woman in the mirror said softly, her reflection grinning wickedly. And now you are its keeper. You will watch over it, just as I did. Emma's eyes widened as the figure in the mirror shifted once more. The woman's face morphed, her skin cracking and peeling like decaying wood. Her form stretched, as if she were coming out of the mirror itself, her presence seeping into the room. The reflection had crossed over, becoming real, solid, an entity now walking beside Emma. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as though the very air had turned to stone, trapping her in place. "There's no going back," the woman whispered, now standing beside her, her cold fingers brushing Emma's cheek. The touch sent a shock of icy terror through Emma's body, making her skin crawl. "You will see the house for what it truly is now. You'll understand what we have become, what you have become." The air grew colder still. Emma could feel it, like ice crawling beneath her skin, filling her veins with freezing dread. The walls around her seemed to close in, the mansion tightening its grip, its dark embrace growing stronger. And then she felt it. The shift in the air, the shift in her own being. Her reflection in the mirror was no longer her. It was the woman, the one who had been haunting her dreams, the one who had led her here. It was as if Emma's identity had been erased, absorbed by the house, swallowed by its insatiable hunger. She was becoming the very thing she had feared. The woman in the mirror grinned widely, her eyes gleaming with a darkness that no longer had to hide. She wasn't just a reflection anymore. She had taken Emma's place, and Emma had become her. Together, they were the house's newest inhabitants, bound to its eternal curse, destined to haunt the halls forever. And so, the cycle continued. Emma's final thought, before the darkness consumed her entirely, was a haunting realization. She had become a reflection, just like the others before her.